The Second World War, as we mentioned in earlier lectures, is what historians like Thomas Zeller have defined as a war of annihilation. It's a total war in which civilian populations and urban areas are targeted equally and as much, if not more, than specific military or naval units, positions, and equipment. All sides were kind of a part to this strategy of annihilation, which is the idea that victory would be achieved when the capacity of the other side to function both militarily and economically and even socially had been really annihilated. All sides participate in this. And of course, we know the Allies, the United States and the British and the Soviet Union, who are fighting Nazi Germany, who turned to fight the Japanese Empire, they are on the right side of history. They are fighting for the right reasons, albeit we can certainly criticize the United States, and we can criticize the British, and we can criticize the Soviet Union for not doing enough when it was clearly apparent what was happening in places like Germany as the Nazis developed and began to persecute the population, Jewish individuals, political dissidents, and so forth. So the United States, for example, certainly holds some responsibility for the full scale of the destruction of the Second World War because it chose to take interest in it and be involved in stopping it far too late. But with that said, the United States, the British, the Soviet Union, fighting the Axis powers, the Japanese, and Germany particularly, as well as Italy, they're on the right side. They're fighting for the right reasons. They're fighting to eliminate, at least in the case of the United States and the British, the same I don't think would be said of the Soviet Union, but the United States and the British are certainly fighting for those principles of the Atlantic Charter, which is to fight for self-determination, for a destruction of militaristic and far-expanding empires. They're fighting for people's rights to human rights and freedom. So they're fighting for the right reasons. But nonetheless, World War II became a war in which all sides applied what would be called the strategy of annihilation in order to achieve success. Now, this was something that was obviously the case long before the United States ever developed the atomic bomb. The Nazis were seeking to annihilate the populations of Jewish individuals, Slavic individuals, and other people that they deemed to be racially inferior. They were doing that as an original plan, so-called Lebensraum, of Nazi Germany to create this racial empire. Japan had sought to create a large, far-flung empire largely by annihilating the populations of places like China, as you see in horrifying events like the rape of Nanjing. When the Allies start fighting against the aggression of the Axis powers, the British and the United States both also respond with a demand for unconditional surrender, that the only way the war could end would be when the Axis powers, particularly Japan and Germany, had surrendered completely and totally and allowed their countries to be occupied and effectively reorganized by the victorious powers. And in achieving this, they applied a strategy of annihilation, which resulted in widespread bombings of urban areas and civilian population areas. The British, famous or infamously, it depends on how you look at an event like this, because these are not things that you should think about as good. Now, they're right, like winning the war and using the methods necessary to win the war is itself right, and the Allies were on the right side of history. But of course, massively bombing cities that have women and children and elderly individuals in them as a tool of breaking the will of the population of a country is not in itself something that can be thought of as good per se, because we're talking about a massive amount of civilian casualties. So the British bombed Dresden. They firebombed the city of Dresden in a terrifying act The British used to use what is firebombing? Firebombing is the using incendiary devices, things like phosphorus that light on fire, and you bomb the area with these types of materials so extensively and so heavily that effectively you light the air on fire, and it creates a firestorm that really just decimates urban areas. So the British became associated with the use of firebombing techniques in defeating Germany, and the United States likewise applied these techniques on Japan before the development of the atomic bomb. This is Tokyo in early 1945 after the U.S. firebombed the city. Now, in old Tokyo, a lot of the building structures were made of wood, and as a result of that, the devastation on the areas firebombed in the city were absolutely devastating, as you can see from this picture. And there were roughly upwards of 80,000 people that probably died. An immediate death toll that is similar to the use of the atomic bomb. Now, the atomic bomb program was known as the Manhattan Project, and the United States began this program in 1939. The Manhattan Project was a massive project, top secret project. The United States built this project, and it did so in a certain level of collaboration with the British. The British, for example, manufactured the aluminum tubes that were used for creating the fissile material needed to create an atomic bomb. The United States, the project really centered on three main locations in the United States. Oak Ridge, Tennessee, which was basically a town facility created for the purpose of building the bomb. Los Alamos, New Mexico, which remains today the center of the United States' atomic programs and military programs today. And Hanford, Washington. This is Hanford right here. Hanford, Washington is the site of a nuclear reactor that was created in the process of making the materials used in the bombs, the Hiroshima bomb and the Nagasaki bomb. Hanford is located in the Columbia River Basin in Washington State, and it was fundamental to making these weapons, and today it remains the largest environmental hazard site in the United States. It is a massive nuclear waste zone still to this day, and the cleanup of it is the largest cleanup zone in the United States. And it's kind of in this respect a sort of a lasting sort of relic and memory of this massive effort to build the atomic bomb, but also to the ramifications of this new technology, not only for cities that were bombed, but for the environment in the United States. Of course, many workers who worked on this weapon in Hanford got cancer and other types of illnesses and birth defects for their children. Of course, the full ramifications of radiation is not understood at this time. We're in the very early stages of understanding, the world is in the very early stages of understanding what technology and what the ramifications of this technology are. Here you see Little Boy, and this was the name that was given to the second atomic bomb that was ever detonated, and this was detonated above Hiroshima. I say above because these bombs were not designed to impact the Earth. They were designed to detonate above the ground to maximize the full blast damage of the weapon. The first bomb was tested in the New Mexico desert in July of 1945 in a test that was called the Trinity test. And it wasn't until that point, by the way, that the United States understood what this weapon was and that it worked. Now, this was a massive, massive technological breakthrough. Certainly, this will open the doors to nuclear energy production as well as the weaponization of these types of things. And this technological breakthrough for the United States was actually made possible to a significant degree by immigrants who fled Nazi persecution. In the 1930s, the Nazis had created the so-called Nuremberg laws, as Nazi Germany sought to create a racially singular state, and they wanted to create a racial empire. And this meant that they went to great lengths to prevent the involvement and participation of people that were deemed non-Aryan, non-white German peoples in Germany. And this meant passing laws that basically eliminated Jewish people from a myriad of professions. The Nuremberg laws, and of course eventually you will see this take full shape in the Holocaust, where you see the mass murder of millions of people as the Nazis seek to eliminate Jewish individuals, people they deem to be lesser individuals, effectively from the world, to create this sort of racist Aryan German empire. The Nuremberg laws, though, were passed in the early 30s, and these were laws that banned Jewish people from being university professors. It banned them from practicing law. It banned them from being doctors, among other things. And so this was all done effectively with the strike of a pen. And so you had a myriad of very significant and intelligent Jewish individuals who had basically had their careers and professions eliminated in a moment. And it was this type of persecution from the racist Nazi leadership of Adolf Hitler that led individuals like Albert Einstein and Edward Teller to come to the United States ultimately. Edward Teller, who became the father of the hydrogen bomb, he was part of the Manhattan Project. Einstein's theoretic principles were used in the Manhattan Project. Without these individuals, creating this type of weapon might not have been possible. And in a way, you can look at this, even though atomic weapons are terrifying, and many of these scientists opposed, like Einstein, the further militarization of these weapons. But they're terrifying, but the technology does open the door, for example, to nuclear energy and other types of technologies. All of your major naval ships today are powered by nuclear power. But these incredible technological accomplishment, in a lot of ways was a symbol of the strength and promise of America. And that is that it was something that was the result directly of people coming to the United States, contributing to what it was the United States does, both economically or technologically or in education. So if you look at Einstein, you look at Teller, you look at these individuals who play this fundamental role in the Manhattan Project, it is very much sort of a symbol of the United States as a place where people from all over the world come together, bringing new ideas, new ways of doing things, new perspectives on society, and coming together to create ultimately some incredible and impressive accomplishments. So even though atomic weapons are themselves, and nuclear weapons are themselves weapons of mass destruction, it's an incredible accomplishment that the United States had achieved here. And of course, Germany had their own such program. And a major reason, undoubtedly, why the United States beat Germany was because it accepted other people ultimately and allowed other people to contribute importantly to fundamental programs and projects, while Germany sought to exclude all these other people on the basis of an overt sort of racial bias and segregation. Not to say there wasn't racism in the United States, of course, but during the war, the United States tried to put that racism aside to come together as one country. This is the B-29 superfortress that dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima. It was piloted by Lieutenant Colonel Paul Tibbets, and in the film Atomic Cafe, you will see him talk a lot about this operation. The Nazi Germany sort of led the world in a number of technologies. Nazi Germany was the first country to create a jet aircraft, the Messerschmitt 262. Nazi Germany was the first country to build a ballistic missile. First the V-1 and the V-2 rocket, which was basically the model for ballistic missiles of the future. However, the United States really led the way when it came to the development of long-range bombers. And so when it had this B-29 built, which was built specifically for the far distances of the Pacific Theater. The United States really was the leader in building bombers. And this plane was built for the long distances that you had to fly from one island to the other in the Pacific Theater of War in fighting Japan. And it was really the only plane capable of dropping a huge atomic bomb, as it did on Japan in 1945. The B-29 boxcar would drop the bomb on Nagasaki only 3 days later. Now, that fact is one of the areas that historians tend to criticize. And the use of the atomic bombs in American history, and this is the last slide, but the use of atomic bombs in the history of World War II and in American history is a very difficult topic. On the one hand, as I said before, it's a monumentous achievement of science and very much a product of very, very smart physicists and scientists and mathematicians coming to the United States fleeing racist persecution in other places. However, in itself, the militarization, the weaponization of these technologies are quite horrifying. And we're talking about the massive targeting of civilian populations in cities. And in some cases, cities like Hiroshima, which had never been bombed throughout the war. And while there were military-related targets there, it was a city. It was a civilian population. Likewise with the city of Nagasaki. So there were some real reasons for historians to look back on this and to criticize the sort of typical narrative that, well, it was a tough thing that had to be done, but it had to be done. That this was the kind of narrative that was always sort of pushed through in American society, that this was the only way to win the war. The reality is Japan as a military power was completely defeated when these bombs were used. But there were other factors playing a part in the decision. For example, in the Yalta Conference, the last conference between Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin, Roosevelt got Stalin to promise to help defeat Japan after the war in Europe was over. The war ended in May, and the Soviet Union started fighting Japan in Manchuria, north of Korea. The United States became very concerned that, seeing what was happening in Germany, Germany became divided after World War II. The United States became very concerned that a communist power might then also divide Japan. So there was a desire to end the war quickly to keep the Soviet Union out of Japan. Japan it had no ability really to sail its navy in a meaningful sense. It had no air force. It was largely defeated at this point. And one of the things that historians criticized a great deal after this, not immediately after it, but in the decades to come, was why a second bomb was dropped only 3 days after Hiroshima. It was really not. Nagasaki is a long way from Tokyo. It's in the very south of the country. And it's one of those factors where a lot of historians examined this and have suggested that they might have done this too quickly, that perhaps 2 bombs wasn't necessary. Perhaps the United States rushed the use of the second bomb. Was the use of the atomic bomb the right choice? To use it once, twice, or not at all? It's something that students of history debate and discuss. The bomb was a catastrophic reality for the people who suffered it. The Hiroshima bomb flattens 4 square miles. 100,000 people died, and this does not count the massive effects from birth defects and cancer. You see similar death tolls from Nagasaki on August 9th, 1945. Part of the reason for this was the policy of unconditional surrender, and unconditional surrender meant that the war would not be over until the aggressor side, in this case the Japanese, had surrendered completely. And so as a result of that, some have criticized that policy for encouraging Japan to hold out longer. Whereas if a negotiated settlement had been on the table, maybe maybe you do not have to go this entire length. But these are just some of the questions that are really brought to the table when you come to think about the usage of a weapon as terrifying as an atomic bomb in war. And at the time, it's not really thought about terribly controversially, though some policymakers and some military thinkers expressed opposition to it at the time. But over time, historians have increasingly debated the rightness of using these weapons in war against Japan and whether or not they were necessary.